All right, welcome to another week in studies in First Peter. This week's lesson is living for God, and it's found in First Peter, chapter 4, verses 1 to 11. And the first section that I look at is the first three verses of chapter 4. We see here that this is tied in with the previous discussion of Christ's suffering, and that we are to arm ourselves with the same attitude as Christ, who suffered in the body. And I think the best way of understanding this is very similar to Paul's understanding of us dying with Christ, being united in his death. That we also, in Peter's view, have suffered kind of vicariously through Christ, and therefore we no longer live for the flesh. And we can arm ourselves with this same attitude, being united with Christ's death. Therefore, we die to self, and now live for God. And Peter reminds the believers that they used to live the way their neighbors did. They used to live sinfully, but now they are to live for God. We look at the next section, beginning in verses 4 to 6, we see that what was happening to them often happens to believers today. That when the believer chooses no longer to live a sinful lifestyle, and it might be a little hard for us to conceive today, but in Peter's day, sexual immorality and living wild lives was often associated with idol worship, and so Christians were being abused because they did not join their neighbors in worship, and really the worship was an idolatry that was really just a thin veil of an excuse for them to indulge their sinful desires. And so they were abused for not joining them in their sin. And it's funny because I think that happens even to today, not directly through idolatry, but by not joining others in their sinful behavior. We are often, at very least, people look at us suspiciously when we don't behave like they do. But Peter's message here is very clear. Uh, the reason why we don't live that way is because we are aware that we are ultimately going to be judged by God. And this is the reason that the gospel was preached to those who died. Now, some associate this with the previous connection of Jesus going and preaching to those in prison. My sense is that Peter here is not making reference back to that, but rather talking about those in their midst who had already died. So, in other words, they had been preached to, and they had responded, and so God was going to judge them based on that. The gospel is preached now because humans make their judgment, but God makes his ultimate judgment. In other words, the reason why you preach the gospel and we seek to win those who do not yet know the Lord is because we know God's judgment's coming. And while our neighbors may make fun of us and abuse us because of our faith, we know that that human judgment makes very little difference in comparison to God's ultimate judgment. And so Peter is reminding the disciples here that, okay, you're being judged by your neighbors. They're criticizing you, but you have to keep in mind God's ultimate judgment, which leads directly into the last section of this passage, uh, verses 7 to 11 of chapter 4, where Peter talks about the end being near. In other words, God's judgment is coming. And so we need to be alert and sober minded. We need to think rightly about the world. We need to be very discerning about what is good. And the reason for that Peter gives us so that we can pray, so that we can be in right relationship with God so we can know how to properly pray, um, what we need to be praying against and what we need to be praying for. In the context of that as well, he next brings up the most practical aspect of the Christian faith, which is to love. And loving, practically worked out, is often hospitality. So Peter commands the believers to show hospitality. And next, and connected with that, is service, that we're to serve one another. And we are to use the gifts that God has given us to serve. And again, we see a very close parallel here with Peter and Paul's teaching on the gifts, that the Spirit gives each of us unique gifts, and we are to use those unique gifts, whatever they might be, in the service of God for others. And so Peter makes this statement that we are stewards of the grace that God has given us in the many forms. And so we have been given these gifts, but they're not ours, that we will give an account for how we use them as well. And so we need to use these gifts in God's strength and for his glory. And this is a very key concept in First Peter. If you remember earlier in the epistle, he said that we are God's people, called out of darkness in order to declare the praises of him who called us out of darkness into light. And so that's a major aspect, that we are blessed to be a blessing, that we have been given grace in many forms so that we might share that grace with others. So that's this next passage in First Peter, and we will discuss further in the next lesson.